It was supposed to be a routine flight Skywings 217 from New York to London. But for Michael Carter, an aerospace engineer with 20 years of experience, something was wrong before they even left the ground. A strange noise from the left engine. A warning dismissed. A disaster waiting to happen. Ignored by the flight crew, mocked by passengers, and shut down by the captain himself. Michael could only sit and watch as the plane took off, knowing that hundreds of lives were now at risk. Then, mid-flight, the unthinkable happens. An explosion at 30,000 feet. A failing aircraft plunging toward the ocean. And suddenly the man they refuse to listen to is the only one who can save them all. But what happens when the truth about the failure is even bigger than the crash itself? Stay tuned for the full story, and don't forget to subscribe for more gripping tales that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Where in the world are you watching from? Let us know in the comments. Michael Carter adjusted his collar as he stepped into the luxurious first-class cabin of Skywings Airlines. The scent of leather seats and freshly brewed coffee filled the air, the hushed voices of elite travelers murmuring over business deals and weekend getaways. Yet, the moment Michael entered, the air changed. A middle-aged white man in a tailored suit glanced up from his newspaper, his brows furrowing. His eyes scanned Michael from head to toe, his neatly pressed shirt, the engineering manuals in his hand, before turning to the flight attendant. "I think this gentleman might be in the wrong cabin," the man said smoothly, the condescension dripping from his voice. "I'm sure he meant to book economy." Michael exhaled slowly, suppressing the irritation bubbling within. He had dealt with this before, many times. The flight attendant, a young blonde woman, hesitated before approaching him. She didn't even glance at his boarding pass. "Sir," she said politely, though there was an edge to her tone, "this section is for first-class passengers only." Michael simply raised his ticket, flashing the first-class label at her. The color drained from her face. "Oh, I didn't realize," she mumbled, stepping aside awkwardly. Michael gave a tight-lipped smile, not bothering to correct her. He walked past the stunned businessman and sank into his seat by the window. He had earned this. He had worked tirelessly for 20 years, designing some of the world's most advanced jet engines. Ironically, the plane he was on, Flight 217, was powered by one of his engines. As he flipped open his engineering manual, the whispering began. "Did you see his seat? What does he do exactly?" "I wouldn't have guessed." Michael ignored them. He had a long flight ahead. But then he heard it. A sound. A low, rhythmic womp 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 from outside the cabin. His head snapped toward the window. His trained ears instantly recognized something wrong with the left engine. His fingers tightened around the armrest. This wasn't normal. Something was off. A chill ran down his spine as he looked around. No one else seemed to notice. But Michael Carter knew engines. And he knew this plane had a problem. And if no one listened, they were all in danger. Michael's fingers drummed against the armrest as he listened intently. The sound was still there, subtle, rhythmic, but unmistakably wrong. It wasn't the usual hum of a healthy engine. It was deeper, more irregular, like a heartbeat skipping a beat. He turned his head, peering through the thick glass of the airplane window. The massive turbofan engine sat just beneath the wing, its colossal blades spinning in a blur. On the surface, everything appeared fine. But Michael knew better. His mind raced through possibilities. Compressor stall? Oil leak? Rotor imbalance? None of those were things you wanted at 35,000 feet. He took a deep breath, unclipped his seatbelt, and stood up. He needed to report this now, before it was too late. A flight attendant, Rebecca, her name tag read, was walking down the aisle, collecting pre-departure drink orders. Michael raised his hand. "Excuse me." She stopped, forcing a smile. "Yes, sir?" Michael kept his voice calm but firm. "I need to speak with the flight crew. I think there's a mechanical issue with the left engine." Rebecca blinked, clearly caught off guard. "A mechanical issue?" She followed his gaze to the window. "Sir, the plane hasn't even taken off. Yet. The pilots would have noticed if something was wrong." Michael shook his head. "Not necessarily. The sensors won't always detect early-stage mechanical failures. But I can hear something unusual. I work with these engines, I know their sounds. Her polite smile faltered, turning into something less patient. Are you a mechanic? Michael exhaled slowly, keeping his frustration in check. I'm an aerospace engineer. I helped design the engines for this aircraft. Rebecca's eyebrows lifted slightly, but instead of concern, there was something else in her expression. Skepticism. Oh. She forced another tight-lipped smile. That's interesting. She clearly didn't believe him. Michael's stomach tightened. He had seen this reaction before. Too many times. The subtle doubt. The dismissive tone. The way people second-guessed his expertise before even considering the possibility that he knew what he was talking about. If he had been an older white man in a suit, she probably would have radioed the cockpit without hesitation. But instead, she glanced toward another first-class passenger, a middle-aged white businessman who had been eavesdropping. The man smirked and muttered just loud enough for Michael to hear. Ah, everyone's an expert these days. Michael ignored him and refocused on Rebecca. Look, I'm not trying to alarm anyone. I just need someone from a flight deck to check. Rebecca hesitated, then sighed. Sir, our ground crew has already inspected the aircraft. If there was a problem, they would have caught it. Michael clenched his jaw. And what if they missed something? A flicker of irritation crossed her face. Sir, I assure you, everything is fine. Please take your seat. Her tone was final. Michael held her gaze for a moment, then exhaled sharply. Fine. He sat down, but his muscles remained tense. His instincts screamed at him. This wasn't over. He pulled out his phone, scrolling through technical documents, trying to calm his nerves. But deep down he knew. He knew that sound. He knew what it meant. And soon, everyone else would know too. Michael sat rigidly in his seat, his fingers clenching and unclenching. The rhythmic womp 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 of the left engine hadn't stopped. If anything, it was growing more distinct. He glanced toward the flight attendants. Rebecca was now chatting with another crew member near the galley, occasionally glancing in his direction, as if he were some kind of inconvenience instead of someone trying to prevent a catastrophe. He had had enough. Michael unbuckled his seatbelt and stood up again. This time, he wasn't asking. He walked past the attendants and made his way toward the front of the cabin, where the cockpit door stood sealed. Sir. Rebecca's sharp voice rang out behind him. You cannot go up there. Michael turned, his patience threadbare. Then you go in and tell the captain that an aerospace engineer with 20 years of experience is telling him to check the left engine before takeoff. Rebecca scoffed. Sir, I already spoke to the crew, and they assured me, then speak to them again. Michael snapped. Because if something goes wrong at 35,000 feet, I guarantee you it won't be fine. At that moment, the cockpit door opened, and a tall man in a crisp pilot's uniform stepped out. Captain David Reynolds. His eyes, a sharp blue, locked onto Michael with immediate disapproval. What's going on here? Rebecca folded her arms. This gentleman insists there's a problem with the left engine. Captain Reynolds sighed loudly, rubbing his temple as if dealing with a toddler throwing a tantrum. He gave Michael a once-over, noting the way he stood, the determined set of his jaw, and, of course, his skin color. Michael had seen that look before. It was the look of a man who had already decided he wasn't worth listening to. Sir, the captain said, his voice laced with forced patience. What exactly do you think is wrong? Michael took a steadying breath, knowing he had one chance to make him listen. There's a misfire in the left engine. I can hear an abnormal cycle pattern. It could be an oil pressure issue, or worse, a compressor stall. Either way, it's not safe to take off until it's checked. Captain Reynolds chuckled, a condescending smirk tugging at his lips. You think our trained ground crew just missed that? Michael's jaw tightened. I think they might have overlooked something. I helped design these engines. Reynolds held up a hand, cutting him off. Right. You're an engineer. That's great. But this isn't some theoretical classroom. I fly these things every day. Michael kept his voice steady. And I build them. The two men locked eyes. Tension thickened. Around them, passengers were beginning to watch. Some whispered to each other. Others simply looked annoyed, as if Michael was nothing more than a disruption to their comfortable flight. Then, a new voice broke the silence. "Captain," came a smooth, authoritative tone. It was Mark Lewis, the lead flight engineer, stepping out from the cockpit. He was an older man with graying hair and a visible air of superiority. "What seems to be the problem?" Lewis asked, giving Michael a pointed look. "This passenger thinks our left engine is about to explode," Reynolds said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. Some passengers laughed quietly. Michael ignored them. He turned to Lewis. "I don't think it will explode yet, but there's a sound coming from the left turbofan that suggests an imbalance in the pressure system. If it's a compressor issue, we could be looking at a catastrophic failure mid-flight." Lewis rolled his eyes. "The system didn't flag anything, son. If there was a real problem, our diagnostics would have caught it." Michael's nostrils flared. "And if the sensor is malfunctioning, you're trusting a screen over an actual expert who can hear the problem." Silence. Then, Reynolds laughed again, this time louder, shaking his head. "I've got 20 years of flying experience," he said. "I think I know when an engine is failing, buddy." "Buddy." Michael's teeth clenched. This wasn't about expertise anymore. It was about ego. Captain Reynolds turned to Rebecca. "Escort him back to his seat. We're on schedule for takeoff." Michael stared at him. "You're making a mistake." Reynolds didn't even look at him. "I'll take my chances." Michael felt rage burning in his chest as Rebecca placed a hand on his arm, ushering him back toward his seat. Passengers watched him return. Some smirked. Others shook their heads. To them, he was just a loud man causing problems. As he sat back down, his fingers tightened around his armrest. The engine's rhythmic womp 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 continued. And deep in his gut, he knew. Soon, they would all realize how wrong they were. Michael sat in tense silence, his hands gripping the armrests as the plane taxied to the runway. The deep, rhythmic thump of the left engine still pulsed in his ears. No one else seemed to notice it, or worse, they chose to ignore it. He cast a glance toward the cockpit door. Behind it, Captain Reynolds and engineer Mark Lewis sat, completely convinced that their systems knew more than an actual engineer. Michael inhaled slowly, forcing himself to stay calm. The arrogance of these men wasn't new to him. He had seen it in boardrooms. He had seen it on factory floors. And now he was seeing it at 35,000 feet, where mistakes weren't just costly, they were fatal. The engines roared louder as the plane accelerated down the runway. His heartbeat quickened. This was the moment of truth. If the compressor stall worsened, it would happen right now, when the engines were at full throttle, straining under maximum force. He pressed his head back against the seat, fists clenched. "Come on, hold together." The nose lifted. The wheels left the ground. Skywings Flight 217 was airborne. And for a moment, everything seemed fine. The flight had settled into a smooth cruise. The seatbelt sign flickered off, and passengers began relaxing. Some ordered drinks, others reclined their seats. Michael, however, did not relax. His gut told him something was wrong. The sound was still there, quieter, but present. He knew that compressor failures didn't always happen immediately. Sometimes they built up, pressure accumulating, until boom. The entire plane lurched violently. A blinding flash of orange fire erupted outside Michael's window. The left engine had exploded. Michael's ears rang as passengers screamed, oxygen masks dropping from the ceiling. Luggage compartments burst open, suitcases and bags tumbling into the aisles. The aircraft pitched sharply to the left, the force slamming Michael against a seat. Somewhere a baby wailed. A woman sobbed. A man cursed loudly. Michael barely registered any of it. His mind had already switched into crisis mode. He turned to look out the window. The left engine was now a mangled mess of fire and debris, its metal casing completely ripped apart. This was exactly what he had warned them about. And now 300 people were in danger because they hadn't listened. Captain Reynolds' hands were white-knuckled on the controls. The entire cockpit shook violently, alarms screaming in his ears. "We lost engine 1, the co-pilot shouted. Reynolds struggled to steady the aircraft. "Stay calm. We're trained for this." But Mark Lewis was not calm. His face was pale as he stared at the warning screens. I don't get it. The system never flagged an issue. This isn't supposed to happen. Reynolds' jaw tightened. Well, it just did. He fought to keep the plane level, but it was losing altitude fast. His training told him they could fly with one engine. But his gut told him this was different. This wasn't a normal failure. This was something worse. And the only person who had seen it coming was the man he had mocked just minutes ago. Reynolds exhaled sharply. His pride wanted to resist, but his fear of crashing outweighed his ego. He hit the intercom. Find the engineer. Now. Rebecca, the flight attendant who had ignored Michael before, now rushed toward him. Her face was pale, her eyes wild with fear. Sir, the captain, he's asking for you. Michael's jaw clenched. Now they needed him. Now, when flames licked at the wing. Now, when people were screaming in terror. Now, when they had no other choice. He unbuckled his seatbelt and stood. Around him, passengers watched with wide, fearful eyes. Some of them, the same ones who had laughed at him earlier, now moved aside without hesitation. Michael didn't waste time. He stormed toward the cockpit. The cockpit was chaos. Warning lights blazed across the control panel, an avalanche of errors and failures. Captain Reynolds turned as Michael entered. His face was tight with barely concealed regret. We need your help, he said, voice tense. Michael stared him down. Say that again. Reynolds hesitated. I say, it. Again. A long, tense silence. Then, finally, we need your help. Michael didn't smirk. He didn't feel satisfaction. Because there was no time. He pushed past Reynolds, sliding into the engineer's seat. His eyes scanned the failing systems. If they didn't fix this fast, the plane would go down into the Atlantic. Michael cracked his knuckles. All right, he muttered. Let's save your damn plane. Michael's fingers flew across the control panel, his sharp eyes scanning the chaotic flood of warning lights. The left engine was gone, but the real problem wasn't just the explosion, it was what came after. The aircraft was losing altitude fast. The force of the blast had damaged the wing structure, and worse, Michael could see from the readouts that the hydraulic system controlling the flaps and stabilizers had been critically compromised. Captain Reynolds clenched the controls, sweat beading on his forehead. We need to divert. Nearest emergency landing strip is over 800 miles away. Michael barely looked up. We won't make it. Not unless we stabilize first. Mark Lewis, the flight engineer who had dismissed him earlier, was pale as he stared at the failing systems. But how? We're losing hydraulic pressure, we can't stabilize. Michael's mind raced. He knew these engines, he had designed them. If there was anyone who could find a way to stabilize this plane, it was him. He grabbed the manual override system and spoke rapidly. We have one shot at this. The explosion severed some control lines, but if we manually adjust power to the remaining engine and redistribute weight, we might be able to compensate just enough to keep the plane level. Reynolds' jaw tightened. You think that'll work? Michael didn't answer. He was already moving. The plane shuddered violently, pitching further to the left. The Atlantic Ocean stretched endlessly below them. Michael's fingers moved across the controls, recalibrating the thrust vectoring of the remaining engine. He rerouted power through secondary hydraulic lines, redirecting just enough control to the stabilizers. Come on, he muttered, sweat trickling down his temple. For a moment, nothing happened. The plane continued to dip downward, alarm still screaming. Reynolds swore under his breath. It's not working. Then, suddenly the nose of the aircraft began to rise. The violent tilting stabilized. The passengers in the cabin, who had been praying and screaming, suddenly felt the motion steady. Rebecca, gripping the back of a seat, gasped, Did he fix it? In the cockpit, Michael exhaled sharply. It's not a fix, he muttered. It's a bandage. We're not out of this yet. Reynolds checked the altitude. They were still descending, but at a much slower rate. We've bought time, Michael said, locking eyes with the captain. Now let's get this thing on the ground before the next thing goes wrong. Reynolds hesitated for a second, then nodded sharply. Where do we land? Michael checked the NAV system, his mind calculating distances. The Azores, he said immediately. Lodge's Air Base. 500 miles out. Mark Lewis, still shaken, looked between them. But we're still losing. Fuel, what if we don't make it? Michael's gaze was deadly serious. Then we better make every second count. Back in the passenger cabin, the atmosphere was on edge. People were gripping their armrests, clutching loved ones, murmuring prayers. Some were still crying, others simply staring ahead, frozen in fear. A man in business class turned to Rebecca, voice shaking. Are we going to crash? She swallowed hard. The crew was working on it. He wasn't satisfied. Who's working on it? Rebecca hesitated, glancing toward the cockpit. Then, in a voice just above a whisper, she said, the man we ignored. In the cockpit, Reynolds was gripping the controls tightly as Michael made final adjustments. Their new course was set Lodge's Air Base, 500 miles away. But they had one more problem. Mark Lewis pointed at the fuel gauge, his face ashen. The explosion ruptured the left fuel line, he stammered. We're leaking. Fast. Michael's mind whirred. How much do we have? Lewis checked again. At this rate? 30 minutes. Michael's stomach dropped. They were 45 minutes from land, which meant they weren't going to make it. Captain Reynolds cursed under his breath. Options. Michael's jaw clenched. There was one. A risky, near impossible maneuver. But it was their only chance. He turned to Reynolds. We need to descend. Now. Reynolds frowned. Why the hell would we go lower? Michael's eyes burned with intensity. Because at a lower altitude, there's more oxygen, which means we can relight the auxiliary engine. Silence. Reynolds and Lewis stared at him. That's insane, Lewis whispered. Michael's voice was deadly serious. So is dying in the Atlantic. Reynolds looked at the fuel gauge. Then at Michael. Then finally he nodded. Let's do it. Michael grabbed the controls, voice calm but firm. Hold on. This is going to be rough. With that, the nose of the aircraft dipped downward and Flight 217 plunged toward the sea. The plane pitched downward, the nose dipping at an angle that sent screams rippling through the cabin. Overhead compartments rattled. Oxygen masks still dangled from their compartments, swaying violently. Michael kept his focus locked on the instruments. His plan was risky and sane, but it was the only way to give them a chance. Behind him, Captain Reynolds was gripping the yoke so tightly his knuckles turned white. How low do we go? He demanded. Michael's eyes flickered to the altitude indicator. We need to drop to 10,000 feet fast. Mark Lewis, still shaken from being proven dead wrong, turned to Michael in disbelief. You seriously think you can restart the auxiliary engine mid-flight? Michael didn't even look at him. I don't think. I know. Reynolds glanced at Lewis, then back at Michael. At this point, his arrogance had finally been burned away by sheer survival instinct. Then let's make it happen, the captain muttered. He pushed the nose further down. The aircraft lurched, turbulence slamming against the fuselage as they lost altitude at an alarming rate. The passengers screamed louder. Rebecca, the flight attendant, was clutching a seat near the galley, her wide eyes darting back to the cockpit. A businessman in first class, one of the ones who had mocked Michael earlier, was now gripping his armrest, so tightly his fingers turned red. We're crashing, someone yelled. Michael's jaw tightened. No, not yet. The altimeter ticked down rapidly. 20,000 feet, 15,000 feet, 12,000 feet. Reynolds gritted his teeth. We're coming up on 10,000. Michael nodded sharply. Prepare for the restart. Lewis hesitated. If this doesn't work, we'll have wasted precious time. Michael cut him off. If we don't do this, we're dead. Lewis, shut up. Reynolds leveled the plane, bringing them to a rocky but stable altitude. Michael exhaled, his fingers flying across the control panel. He knew exactly what to do. The auxiliary engine, a small backup power unit hidden in the tail of the aircraft, had been disabled after the explosion. But now, with the increase in oxygen levels at a lower altitude, there was a chance he could force an ignition. A chance. Michael's voice was steady but urgent. I need you to reduce power to 40% on the right engine. Reynolds did as he was told without hesitation. Michael reached for the auxiliary power switch. His pulse pounded in his ears. If he was wrong, if the fuel-air mixture wasn't right, if the ignition system was too damaged, there was no plan B. He pressed the switch. A beat of silence. Then a deep, sputtering cough came from the rear of the aircraft. Michael's breath hitched. Come on, come on. For a second, nothing happened. And then WHOMPH. The auxiliary engine roared to life. The cabin lights flickered, then stabilized. Lewis let out a stunned breath. It worked. Michael didn't celebrate. We're still leaking fuel. We need to land. Now. Reynolds snapped back into action. Lodge's air base is 300 miles out. We're making for it. Rebecca ran a shaking hand through her hair as she moved through the cabin, checking on the passengers. A woman was still sobbing into her hands. A man was hyperventilating into a paper bag. Others just sat there, stunned into silence. But as she passed by row 3, she noticed something. The businessman who had sneered at Michael earlier was staring at the cockpit, his face a mixture of disbelief and guilt. He turned to Rebecca, voice hoarse. That guy, the engineer. He saved us, didn't he? Rebecca swallowed hard. Yes, he did. The businessman looked down, his hands trembling slightly. I thought he was just causing trouble. Rebecca didn't say anything. She didn't have to, because now every single person on that plane knew the truth. They had judged the wrong man, and if it weren't for him, they would all be dead. The aircraft was still losing fuel. Michael's quick fix had bought them time, but it wasn't enough. The gauges showed less than 15 minutes of fuel remaining. Reynolds cursed. We need to cut all unnecessary power, keep everything focused on that right engine. Michael nodded. We're flying on fumes, but we'll make it. Lodge's air base came into view on the navigation screen. They were close. Too close. Lewis' eyes widened. We're coming in way too fast. Michael reacted instantly. Dropped the landing gear manually. Reynolds reached for the emergency lever and yanked it down. A deep groan vibrated through the aircraft. Then thud-thud. Landing gear deployed. The radio crackled. Skywings 217, you are clear for emergency landing. Runway is ready. Reynolds exhaled sharply. All right, let's bring her home. The plane descended rapidly, the ground rushing toward them. Michael tightened his grip on the console. They had one shot. One. Final test. The moment of truth had arrived. The runway at Lodge's air base loomed ahead, a narrow strip of salvation amidst the endless Atlantic Ocean. But Flight 217 wasn't gliding in like a routine landing, it was falling. The aircraft was still coming in too fast, the fuel reserves dangerously low. The right engine was straining under the entire weight of the plane, and the damaged hydraulics meant they had limited control over descent speed. Michael sat in the cockpit, his hands gripping the panel as his mind calculated every variable. Too steep, too fast, too much weight on the right side. If they hit the runway at the wrong angle, the landing gear would collapse, sending them into a fiery skid. Reynolds, still gripping the yoke with white-knuckled hands, let out a breath. Michael, how do we slow this thing down? Michael's eyes flicked across the controls. We need to dump as much weight as possible. Deploy the flaps manually. Mark Lewis shook his head. The left side's flaps are damaged, we can't control them properly. Michael's mind raced. He had designed this aircraft model. He knew its limits, its capabilities, and every single flaw the manufacturers tried to ignore. There's one more way, he said. Cut power to the right engine at the exact right moment just before we touch down. Reynolds blinked. Kill the engine right before landing? It'll force the plane to drop onto the runway, transferring all weight to the landing gear. No bounce, no skid. It's rough, but it's the only way to avoid a runway overrun. Lewis paled. If we cut power too early, we stall and crash, Michael finished. I know. That's why the timing has to be perfect. Reynolds locked eyes with Michael, finally understanding that this man wasn't just some stubborn passenger. Michael Carter was the only reason any of them were still alive. The captain nodded. All right. Tell me when. The radio crackled. Skywings 217, you're coming in hot. Reduce speed immediately. We're working on it, Reynolds muttered. The ground rushed toward them. 500 feet, 400 feet, 300 feet. Michael's pulse pounded in his ears. 200 feet. The plane was still too fast. 100 feet. Michael's eyes sharpened. Now. Reynolds cut the throttle. The aircraft lurched forward, gravity grabbing hold as the plane's full weight slammed onto the landing gear. Boom. The impact sent a violent jolt through the cabin. Overhead compartments burst open, loose. Objects scattered. The entire aircraft shuddered, rubber burning against asphalt as the tires screamed. Reynolds yanked the reverse thrusters. Mark Lewis pulled the emergency brakes. The entire plane groaned under the force. Smoke billowed from the tires. Metal screeched. The aircraft skidded down the runway, slowing. And then, as Series thud, the plane stopped. Silence. A deep, eerie silence. Then, suddenly cheers. Sobs. Laughter. Relief. Inside the cabin, passengers clung to each other, crying, gasping, whispering prayers. A mother clutched her child, sobbing into his hair. A businessman who had once mocked Michael now sat with tears in his eyes, gripping the seat in front of him. Rebecca, the flight attendant, exhaled sharply, her hands still trembling. They had survived. They were alive. Reynolds sat frozen in his seat, his fingers still wrapped around the yoke. His chest rose and fell sharply, his mind catching up with what had just happened. They had just performed a landing that should have been impossible, and they had only done it because of one man. The man he had ignored. The man he had dismissed. The man he had laughed at. Slowly, Reynolds turned. Michael Carter was still seated in the engineer's chair, his breathing steady, his expression unreadable. He wasn't gloating. He wasn't demanding recognition. He had simply done what needed to be done. Reynolds swallowed hard. And then, for the first time since Michael had stepped onto this plane, the captain extended his hand. Michael looked at it. A beat passed. Then, he reached out and shook it. Thank you, Reynolds said, voice thick with sincerity. Michael simply nodded. Next time, listen. Reynolds didn't argue, because he knew there wouldn't be a next time if Michael hadn't been there today. Passengers poured out of the plane, some still trembling, some kissing the ground the moment they stepped off. A team of emergency responders rushed toward the aircraft, but the crisis was over. Michael exited last. As he stepped down the stairs, a small crowd of passengers was waiting. Rebecca was there, her eyes still red-rimmed. So was the businessman from first class, the same one who had assumed Michael didn't belong. For a long moment, they just looked at him. Then, the businessman stepped forward. I was wrong about you, he admitted, voice thick with shame. I shouldn't have assumed. Michael held his gaze. But you did. The businessman flinched, but nodded. And I'll never make that mistake again. A beat of silence. Then softly, thank you. Rebecca stepped forward. For everything, she whispered. Michael took a slow breath. He hadn't done this for their thanks. He had done it because it was the right thing to do. But as he looked at the faces around him, at the people who had judged him, ignored him, disrespected him, he saw something new. Recognition. Respect. A hard-earned lesson they wouldn't forget. Michael adjusted his collar and gave a small, knowing nod. Next time, he said, turning toward the terminal, believe people when they know what they're talking about. And with that, he walked away. The morning after the emergency landing, Lodge's Air Base was a hive of activity. Investigators, engineers, and airline officials swarmed around the charred remains of Flight 217's left engine, snapping photos and reviewing data logs. Michael Carter stood at a distance, watching. His part in this was over, or so he thought. The passengers had already been transferred to a replacement flight, heading toward their final destinations. Some had even approached him before leaving, shaking his hand, thanking him for saving their lives. But Michael wasn't thinking about them. He was thinking about the engine, because something still wasn't right. Mr. Carter? Michael turned to see a man in a navy suit approaching. Sharp features, slicked back hair, a company badge clipped to his belt. David Holloway, Skywings Airlines Senior Safety Investigator. Michael had met enough corporate men like him before, the kind that smiled while they buried the truth. Holloway extended a hand. Hell of a landing yesterday. Michael shook it, though his face remained unreadable. What do you need? Holloway's smile barely faltered. We'd like you to sit in on the preliminary investigation, given your unique insight into the situation. Michael raised an eyebrow. Skywings Airlines had ignored him. Before now they wanted his expertise? Still, he wasn't about to walk away. Not when he had questions of his own. He followed Holloway toward the restricted area, where a team of NTSB investigators and Skywings engineers had gathered. Captain Reynolds and Mark Lewis were already there. Reynolds nodded stiffly at Michael, his pride still raw, but there was no hostility in his gaze anymore. Lewis, however, couldn't even look at him. Michael crossed his arms. Let's hear it. An NTSB investigator, a woman named Karen O'Malley, stepped forward. She pointed to a burnt section of the engine casing, now laid open for inspection. We've reviewed the initial data logs, she said. The failure appears to have originated in the compressor assembly, which suffered a catastrophic breakdown. High-speed debris shredded the internal structure, leading to the explosion. Michael nodded slowly. And what caused the failure? O'Malley hesitated. We're still determining that. Holloway cut in smoothly. It's likely just a case of wear and tear, possibly exacerbated by an undetected manufacturing flaw. Michael's eyes narrowed. That's convenient. Holloway's smile didn't waver. You have another theory? Michael stepped closer to the engine wreckage. His fingers traced the jagged edges of the damaged compressor casing. He had seen similar failures before, but not from wear and tear. This was something else, something deeper, something Skywings Airlines didn't want to talk about. Michael turned back to the group. What about maintenance records? O'Malley glanced at Holloway, as if seeking permission. Holloway hesitated, then nodded. Go ahead. She handed Michael a tablet, displaying Flight 217's last recorded maintenance logs. Michael scrolled through them, reading, absorbing, calculating. Then his stomach dropped. The last comprehensive engine check had been 18 months ago. That was impossible. Skywings Airlines policy required detailed inspections every 12 months, and yet, here it was. A missing 6 months of maintenance. Michael's head snapped up. This plane was overdue for an inspection. Reynolds stiffened. What? Holloway's jaw tightened. It's possible there was a clerical oversight. Michael cut him off. No, this wasn't an oversight. Someone signed off on an engine that should have been grounded. Silence. The realization settled over the group like a storm cloud. This wasn't just an accident. This was negligence. And Skywings Airlines knew it. Holloway cleared his throat, regaining his composure. We'll conduct a full internal review. Michael laughed bitterly. No, you won't. You'll bury this. You'll blame it on a random component failure and move on. Holloway's expression hardened. Mr. Carter, I'd advise you to be careful with your accusations. Michael took a step closer. And I'd advise you to care more about the 300 people who almost died yesterday. Tension crackled between them. Reynolds, silent until now, suddenly spoke up. Michael's right. Everyone turned to him. The captain's face was grim. I trusted that engine. I trusted the maintenance team. And I almost flew 300 people into the ocean because of it. Holloway's jaw tightened. Captain, no, Reynolds snapped. I don't care about company politics. If this was a preventable failure, then someone has to answer for it. Michael's respect for the captain shifted slightly. The man had ignored him before, but at least he had the guts to admit he was wrong. Holloway exhaled through his nose, then forced a thin smile. Of course. We'll ensure a thorough investigation. Michael wasn't fooled. This was just corporate damage control. But now that he had seen the truth, he wasn't letting it go. As the meeting ended, Michael began walking toward the exit until Holloway called after him. Mr. Carter. Michael turned. Holloway's polite. Facade had faded, replaced with something colder. A word of advice, Holloway said. You're an exceptional engineer, a respected man in your field. Michael crossed his arms. And Holloway's smile didn't reach his eyes. People in your position should be careful where they point fingers. A threat. A warning. Michael stared him down. And corporations like yours should be careful how much blood they try to wash off their hands. A tense beat. Then Michael turned and walked away. His fight wasn't over yet. If Skywings Airlines thought they could bury the truth, they had no idea who they were dealing with. Michael Carter sat in his hotel room, the dim light of his laptop screen casting a pale glow over his face. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, his mind racing. The maintenance records from Flight 217 weren't just a clerical error. Someone had signed off on a falsified inspection. Someone had cut corners and nearly gotten 300 people killed. And now, Skywings Airlines wanted to bury it. Michael wasn't about to let that happen. But the question remained, how far was he willing to go? A knock at the door snapped him out of his thoughts. Michael frowned. He wasn't expecting anyone. He rose cautiously, peering through the peephole. Rebecca, the flight attendant who had dismissed him at first, but who had also been one of the first to realize how wrong she had been. Michael opened the door. Rebecca. She glanced over her shoulder, as if making sure no one had followed her. Can I come in? Michael stepped aside. She walked in quickly, arms folded, visibly tense. I saw you at the investigation today, she said. I saw your face when you looked at those records. Michael sighed, rubbing a hand over his jaw. Then you already know. They're covering it up. Rebecca swallowed hard. I don't know much about engineering, but I do know that planes shouldn't have been flying. And I know that if you go up against Skywings alone, you're going to lose. Michael eyed her carefully. What are you saying? She took a deep breath. I want to help. Michael raised an eyebrow. Why? Rebecca hesitated. Then her voice softened. Because I ignored you, she admitted. I treated you like some know-it-all passenger, when I should have listened. And because of that, I was 1 second away from dying in the Atlantic. Her hands curled into fists. I can't just walk away from that. Michael studied her for a moment. She was serious. He nodded. All right. Then let's bring this to light. Rebecca exhaled, relieved. I might have something useful. I have a friend in Skywings Internal Operations. She's been complaining for months about pressure from the top to approve maintenance checks faster. Michael's gut tightened. What's her name? Claire Dawson, Rebecca said. She's a junior maintenance officer, but she's been with the company for years. If anyone has seen how deep this goes, it's her. Michael grabbed his phone. Can you get me a meeting? Rebecca pulled out her own phone. I can try. She stepped aside, dialing quickly. The call rang 3 times before a woman's voice answered. Claire, it's me. I need a favor. 1 hour later, Michael and Rebecca sat in a dimly lit cafe near the airbase. Across from them, Claire Dawson sat hunched over a steaming cup of coffee, her hands shaking slightly. She was nervous. You know I could lose my job for this, Claire muttered. Rebecca leaned forward. Claire, people almost died. Claire exhaled sharply, her fingers tightening around the cup. I know. Michael watched her carefully. What happened to Flight 217's engine? Claire hesitated, then pulled out her phone. She swiped through files before turning the screen toward them. Michael's eyes narrowed. A maintenance report, time-stamped 7 months ago. Michael scanned the document and then his blood ran cold. The report clearly flagged an issue with the left engine's compressor. The assigned mechanic had recommended an immediate full inspection and component replacement. But stamped at the bottom in bold red letters were the words, cleared for flight, signed, D. Holloway. Michael's stomach dropped. David Holloway, the same Skywings investigator who had smiled at him earlier today, the same man who had threatened him. Claire looked away. They forced us to sign off on faulty engines. Holloway approved it personally. Michael clenched his fists. He knew it. This wasn't just incompetence. This was criminal. Rebecca swallowed hard. Claire, if we take this public, they'll come after you. Claire gave a hollow laugh. They already have. You think I don't know what happens to employees who speak out? Skywings has covered dozens of safety violations. I've seen people fired for less. Michael leaned forward. What about the press? We go to the aviation board. The newspapers. Claire shook her head. Skywings owns the narrative. Their lawyers will bury this in legal red tape. We need something they can't ignore. Michael thought for a moment. Then, an idea struck him like lightning. The black box. Rebecca and Claire both looked at him. The black box from Flight 217, Michael clarified. It recorded everything. The engine warnings. The system malfunctions. The exact moment of failure. Claire's eyes widened. You think it'll prove they knew about the problem? Michael nodded. If Holloway overrode the engine warning system, it'll be in the logs. Rebecca bit her lip. But who has the black box right now? Michael already knew the answer. The NTSB does. Rebecca frowned. Then how do we get it? Michael exhaled. We don't. They turned to him, confused. Michael's jaw tightened. We just need to make sure it never disappears. Claire straightened. I might know someone at the NTSB who can make sure it gets reviewed properly. But we need to move fast. If Holloway gets to it first, it'll be lost in processing forever. Michael nodded. Then we move now. Rebecca exhaled. And if Skywings finds out? Michael's voice was firm. They already know we're digging. Now, we make sure they can't bury it. He stood up, determination burning in his eyes. The fight wasn't over. But for the first time, Michael wasn't just reacting. He was taking the fight straight to them. And Skywings Airlines was about to learn the hard way that some men refuse to be ignored. Michael Carter had spent his career building planes, not fighting corporations. But after what Skywings Airlines had done after they had lied, ignored warnings, and nearly killed 300 people, he was done playing nice. They had tried to silence him. They had tried to bury the truth. But now, the truth was about to bury them. Michael, Rebecca, and Claire sat huddled in a small office inside Lodge's airbase, staring at a laptop screen. The connection was weak, but it was enough. On the other end of the video call was Dr. Alan Patel, a senior investigator with the NTSB, and more importantly, someone Claire trusted. Patel adjusted his glasses. You're telling me you have evidence that Skywings approved a faulty engine? Claire nodded firmly. Yes. I have the maintenance records, and I personally saw Holloway sign off on them. He knew this engine wasn't safe. Patel let out a long breath, running a hand through his graying hair. That's serious. If true, it's criminal negligence. Michael leaned in. Then you need to check the black box from Flight 217. If Holloway tampered with the warning system, it'll be in the logs. Patel hesitated. The black box is still in transit to our headquarters in Washington. I can flag it for priority review, but if someone inside Skywings tries to interfere, Michael's voice was cold and firm. Then we go public before they can cover it up. Patel looked at him carefully. That would be a big risk. Michael's jaw tightened. Not as big as the risk they took with 300 lives. Patel nodded slowly. All right. I'll make sure the black box gets a full, transparent review. And if the data matches what you're saying, Skywings won't be able to hide. A beat of silence. Then Patel added, I hope you're ready for a fight, Carter. Because once this comes out, they'll come after you. Michael didn't flinch. Let them. The moment the call ended, Claire got to work. She forwarded copies of the forged maintenance records to 3 trusted reporters in the aviation industry. At the same time, Rebecca reached out to passengers from Flight 217 people who had lived through the near crash and were willing to speak up. Within hours, the story was spreading. First, it hit small aviation blogs. Then, bigger news outlets picked it up. And finally, breaking news. Skywings Airlines faces allegations of negligence after Flight 217 engine failure. The article exploded across social media. Michael scrolled through the comments, watching people react in real time. I was on that flight. This is insane. Thank God for that engineer. Skywings needs to be investigated now. Who else has they put in danger? Michael exhaled. They weren't invisible anymore. Michael barely had time to process the reaction before his phone buzzed. Unknown number. He answered. Carter. A familiar voice oozed through the receiver. David Holloway. You really should have kept your mouth shut, Holloway said, his voice calm but dangerously cold. Michael leaned back in his chair. You really should have done your job. Holloway chuckled softly. You have no idea what you started. Do you really think a few reporters and some angry passengers are enough to take us down? Michael's grip on the phone tightened. We don't need to take you down, Holloway. We just need to make sure the truth comes out. Silence. Then Holloway's voice dropped to a low whisper. If you think Skywings is going to let this go, you're a bigger fool than I thought. Michael's blood ran cold. It wasn't just a threat. It was a promise. That night, Patel sent Michael a secure email. Attached were preliminary black box findings from Flight 217. Michael's heart pounded as he opened the file. And there it was. A line of error codes, time-stamped 30 minutes before takeoff. The plane's internal systems had detected a pressure imbalance in the left engine, just like Michael had warned. But instead of being flagged for maintenance, the error had been manually overridden by none other than David Holloway. Michael's hands shook with rage. They hadn't just ignored the problem. They had covered up in real time, while 300 passengers sat on that plane completely unaware. And they had been willing to let them die for it. Michael clenched his jaw. This wasn't just corporate negligence. This was attempted manslaughter. Michael sent the black box data to every major news outlet that had picked up the story. Within an hour, the headlines changed. New evidence proved Skywings Airlines ignored engine failure warnings before Flight 217 incident officials call for criminal investigation into Skywings executives. And then David Holloway terminated from Skywings amid growing scandal. Michael let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. It wasn't over yet, but the walls were closing in. On Skywings, they had tried to silence him. Now, the whole world was listening. 2 days later, Michael stood outside a courthouse, preparing to testify before aviation regulators. A familiar voice called out behind him, Mr. Carter. Michael turned to see Captain Reynolds approaching. The older man looked different. The arrogance from their first meeting was gone. There was only respect. I wanted to say, Reynolds exhaled. I was wrong. About you. About everything. Michael studied him. Yes, you were. Reynolds smirked. And I suppose you won't let me forget it. Michael finally allowed himself a small grin. Not a chance. They shook hands. This time, it wasn't forced. It was earned. In the weeks that followed, Skywings Airlines saw its stock plummet. Investigations led to multiple executives resigning, and federal regulators tightened safety inspections across the industry. Michael didn't care about revenge. He cared about change. And this time, they had no choice but to listen. As he packed his bags, preparing to leave Lodge's air base, Rebecca approached him. So, she said, smirking, you saved 300 lives and took down a corrupt airline executive. What's next? Michael adjusted his collar. Next time someone ignores a warning, he said, I'll make sure they never forget it. Michael Carter's story is a reminder to all of us: never ignore the truth, never let arrogance cloud judgment, and never underestimate the power of speaking up. How many disasters could be prevented if people just listened? If you made it to the end of the story, let us know where in the world you're watching from. And if you love thrilling, high-stakes stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Hit that like button, turn on notifications, and stay tuned for more incredible stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments below.